Greetings from Cyberdelic Space. This is Lorenzo, and I'm your host here in the Psychedelic Salon. And I want to welcome you to this, my 100th podcast from the Psychedelic Salon. A few weeks back, in response to an email inquiry from one of our fellow saloners, I said that I didn't have any plans to do anything special for my 100th program. And that was true. 3 weeks ago, I had no idea what I was going to do for the program today. But then the magic began, and synchronicities, you might call them, or maybe this is all just a big coincidence, but here's what happened. I received an email from a fellow saloner who told me about some cassette tapes he had from back in the 80s and 90s that were talks Terence McKenna and others had given. Did I want to check any of them out for possible podcasting, he asked. And I'll tell you more about our benefactor at the end of today's program. So I said, sure, send me a few of them and I'll see if they fit. Well, a week later, a box of 7 well-used cassette tapes arrived, and on the top of the pile was one that was a talk that Terence McKenna gave in 1983 at the Psychedelics and Spirituality Conference in Santa Barbara. And I'll have much more to say about that conference and the particular talk that Terence gave in just a little bit. But first, I want to play for you the talk that was on the other side of this tape. Now, I don't expect this to have the same effect on you as it did, and still does, on me. In fact, it's really hard to tell this story because the synchronicity involved in this particular talk, just magically appearing just in time for my 100th podcast, has impacted me in ways that I still don't understand. I'll try to keep this story as brief as possible. Back in 1984, about 1 year after the talk you're about to hear was given, I had my very first experience with psychoactive substances. I was a true drug virgin, hadn't even tried marijuana at that point, and I was almost 42 years old. The substance I first tried was MDMA, and before I even came down from that first experience, I knew with absolute certainty that these magic medicines held the keys to our future as a species, if we are to have one, that is. And in short, my first encounter produced in me a sort of spiritual epiphany. Not religious, but spiritual. And so I immediately began to search for anything I could find that supported my very naive view of psychedelic substances. And within days of that experience, what fell into my hands was a worn and tattered mimeograph copy of a talk given by someone called Sasha Shulgin. The title of the talk was Drugs of Perception, and the handwritten notation at the top of the first page simply read, Psychedelic Conference, Santa Barbara, California, 1983. You just really can't imagine my excitement back then to learn that there even had been a psychedelic conference. You know, I was sure it must have been held in some secret location with all kinds of security. Keep in mind that this was at the beginning of the Reagan years, and the drug war was just really getting up to speed. In Texas, where I was living at the time, people were getting 40-year sentences just for having a single joint in their possession. Back then in Dallas, Texas, in the Irish Catholic Republican lawyer circles I ran in, you never even mentioned the word drugs. And what I was about to learn is that another kind of world existed in parallel, and even in Dallas. And so to make a long story short, I became involved in helping to distribute MDMA to large numbers of people. However, I still had one foot firmly planted in the straight world, and I was firmly convinced that even the pillars of the community in Dallas would come around to our way of thinking once they tried MDMA, or ecstasy as we called it then. And to convince my straight friends to try it for the first time, I had them read that talk by Sasha. And I always called it his Why Do I Do What I Do talk. And it was mandatory reading if you wanted to deal with me. I know that's a little anal, but I'm only telling this long story just to give you some small sense of how important this talk has been in my life. Reading it the first time was definitely a major turning point in my life. And so to have it show up on my doorstep just in time for my 100th podcast, and by the way, this is the first time I've actually heard this talk myself, so hopefully you can understand what it means to me to be able to play this talk for you right now. And here it is, way back in 1983 at the Psychedelics and Spirituality Conference in Santa Barbara, California. The one and only Sasha Shulgin.
There was a meeting last year when Dr. Hoffman came, and his opening sentence was, "You expected the shaman, you're going to get a chemist." When I was first asked by Dr. Robert Gordon McCutcheon to come here tonight and talk about whatever I wanted to do, my first impression, as long as I allowed my first impression, was to decline. I had, after all, I am a student of chemistry and of pharmacology and not really a student of philosophy and religion. And I felt I had probably contributed as much as I could last year when I took chalk to blackboard and drew hexagons and tryptamine rings and gave my impression of what on a molecule caused it to do what. But my wife intervened. Why not tell them just why you do what you do? It got me launched into an interesting question. I never had actually spoken to myself and said, why do you do what you do? The flippant answer is always at hand. Well, one does it because it's there to be done. The Mount Everest routine. I climb the mountain because it's there to be climbed. But that is, of course, not the reason I do the research I do. Whenever this question would come up in a seminar or during a panel discussion, I'd place special emphasis on the word psychotomimetic. The word has been used quite a bit today. A term that is usually used by the scientific community when they wish to speak about the psychedelic drugs. The term psychedelic does not find a good audience in the psychiatric or in the chemical or in the medical literature. It carries a meta-message of drug use, drug encouragement, drug proselytizing, and as a result, the word is not often encountered. In its origin, as was pointed out, it comes from psychoto, meaning in essence psychosis, and mimesis, meaning the imitation of. And this indeed is a term that very early in the work in this area that had been given these materials because they had been cast in the role of causing syndrome, causing symptoms that would reflect the character of mental illness. And it's felt by studying the effects of these materials in normal subjects, you might be able to glean some insight as to the mechanisms or at least the descriptions and definitions of this syndrome when seen in people who are spontaneously ill. This explanation, the search for new psychotomimetics, for materials that would be more exacting in definition of psychosis, is completely logical in that but most of the hallucinogenics, the psychedelics that are known, can be classified into materials that are indoles, and there are many in this area, the tryptamines, the more convoluted carbolines, LSD as an ergot-type indole, or it can be classified as phenethylamines. And there are perhaps some 3 or 4 score that are in this classification. The analogs of mescaline compound has been mentioned several times, or the substitution variants of mescaline, or the alpha-methyl compounds that have given rise to the materials that are lumped chemically together as the amphetamines. And there are 2 principal neurotransmitters in the brain. One is an indole, and this is serotonin. One is a phenethylamine, namely dopamine. And it's very desirable from the point of the neurochemist to find pigeonholes that can classify things. Here we have a group of psychedelics that are all indoles, and we have a neurotransmitter that's indolic, serotonin. Here's a group that are all phenethylamines, and we have a neurotransmitter that's a phenethylamine. All we have to do is understand why all of these work here and all of those work there, and we shall now know how the neurotransmitters work in the brain. And once we know that, we'll be able to cure mental illness. Well, it's an appealing, and it has not been a particularly rewarding classification. And the explanation, beside being logical, is quite safe, because it's an unthreatening explanation. It's easily accepted by the academic and the administrative community. But the explanation is still not the explanation of why I do what I do. My work is indeed dedicated to